Ali and I'm going to show you how to make a rouleau neck trim similar to what's on this vintage dress I have. I'll show you two different ways how to make the rouleaus, I'll show you how to put them on and then how to finish it off. This kind of trim works on any kind of neck edge, a cuff trim, you could have it as a pocket detail or even in a seam. Okay, so let's get started. I've cut this fabric with a curve so it's like a neckline, and then I've done a facing as well. So if this is the inside of the neck, then this is the facing that's going to go on it, and that's got a 1 centimetre seam allowance around it. So I need to first prepare the trim for going on it. I'm going to do the trim in a slightly different colour just so it stands out a bit better on the video. So the first thing I need to do is I need to cut lots of bias strips for making the trim. So you just need to work out how wide you want them when they're finished. A great way, if I move that, a great way for drawing the bias strips is using one of these rulers. Unfortunately, mine is broken, but you've got the 45-degree angle, you've got all the line spacing, so it makes it nice and easy. So I'm going to draw these on with some chalk first. So I'm going to start by lining up, you probably can't see it at all on the video, but that's my 45-degree angle that I'm lining up with the straight edge here, just to start that one off. And then I can continue it up here, just because my ruler's broken, it's not quite long enough to do the whole thing. So that's my first line, and then I'm just going to use the lines on here to space these out and just draw a series of lines. So it's up to you how wide you do yours. So this is an imperial grid here, so I'm going to draw my lines 1 inch apart, which is pretty much 2.5 centimetres. So I'm just going to draw a whole series of these, as I need quite a few little strips. So that should be more than enough for what I'm doing, so I'm just going to cut all of my little strips out. So now that I've got all of these cut out, I just need to sew them lengthwise before I turn them around. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in each just to get me started off. I don't need to pin the whole way down, but I just always put a couple in to start with so that I know nothing is twisted. So these are all now ready to sew. I've probably cut a lot more than I need, but it's better to cut too much than not enough. So I'm now just going to sew down the length of each of my bias strips. Just do a couple of practice ones to make sure you're happy with the size. Those are all sewn up, so I now need to just turn them the right way around. So I'm going to show you two ways of doing it. The easiest way is using a rouleau turner like this. They're only really cheap and I totally recommend getting one. So you just push it through, and then all you've got to do, there's a little catch at the end, is you just pull that through the fabric and then this comes through. The slipperier that your fabric is, the easier it is to turn. But you don't want to make these super skinny, so they should be nice and easy to turn even on a cotton like this. The other way I'm going to show you, if you haven't got one of these, is just to use a needle. So use a nice big chunky needle and leave your thread really long when you finish sewing it. And then I've threaded that through there, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this. You want to pull the thread out of the way and then just cut it to a point like that. Make sure you don't cut that thread off. And then you want to thread it through here, but don't thread it through on the sharp end because it's going to get caught. So thread it through on the blunt end. And just thread that through till it comes out the other side. The shorter the bits are that you're doing, the easier this is going to be. So just thread it through the other side, and then you can take the needle off. And then just really carefully and gently pull it through, because what you don't want to do is pull it so hard that it snaps that thread. And then once it's going, it should pull through nice and easily. As long as you're not doing this with a really heavy fabric. You can see that's got bunched up there because I just pulled that too quickly. So I'm just going to pull that back again and just take it slowly. And then as long as you do, once that's out the other side, you can finish the rest off quickly. So that's a good way of doing it if you don't have a turner. So I'm just going to finish turning the rest of these. If you think you can hear a funny noise in the background, you're not wrong. That's my iron. It is quite noisy. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to use the chalk. You don't have to do this, but I think it's going to be easier for me to show you what I'm doing. Is I'm just going to use the chalk to draw on here where my seam line is. So there's a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I'm just drawing on here 1 centimetre from the edge. Hopefully that's nice and clear where that line is. And then what I need to do is I need to decide what kind of size I want my trim to be. So you can obviously do this however you want to do it. So I'm just going to do it fairly small in a regular shape. You could mix two different colours together and alternate them. There's so many variations of what you could do. So when it's finished, it's going to be going that way, but when you're sewing it, you want it to go the opposite direction. So you need to work out, the best way I think to do it is just to fold it in the shape it's going to be and then put it underneath, and then you can have a look from this cut edge what kind of size you want it. So I want a little gap in between, and then my next one is going to come like that. But the length I want for this next bit is from the edge here to where the cut edge is. So that's 1 3/4 centimetres for me. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line from my seam line that exact distance, so 1.75 centimetres. I'm just going to draw that all the way around. If you've got a fabric that you don't want to put chalk on, then you could just do quite a loose basting stitch or something like that that will unpick nice and easily. So now that both lines are on, I just need to get this ready to sew it on. So as I said, it needs to face this way. This line here is where I stitch it, so I can use the cut edge to line that up here. So I'm just going to put a pin in that first one to start it off, and then I'm going to fold it over, and where I want that fold is on this second line here. And then I'm just going to put another pin in, and then I need to fold it this way. So I'll just take that out for a sec. And I don't want to have a gap where that bit is. I don't know how well you can see it, but that where they cross over is exactly where that line is. And then I'll just put that pin back in. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same all the way around here. And because these are made on the bias, it means they'll mould to the shape really well. And then when you get to the point where it's not long enough, then you can just cut the excess of that off and then just start with your next piece and just basically carry on all the way around. So I've now got my little bias strips all pinned on and ready to sew. So that's my stitch line there. And then that was literally just to line these up. So I can rub that out in a second. And what I need to do now is I need to just sew this on my stitch line here. So it kind of gets a little bit lost once you're doing this. So just work out where it lines up to the seam guide here. I did mine 1 centimetre, so I'm just going to line it up there. So I'm just going to get started sewing it, and I just need to make sure that these don't move. So I know when they go that way, I've got a little tiny gap, and then where they meet this side, I want them to touch. So I just need to hold that with a pin as I sew through it to make sure that nothing slips. And I'm just going to really take my time sewing around here, making sure it all stays in place. That's all now sewn on, so I can just start rubbing that chalk off. It takes a little bit of rubbing sometimes to get it off, but that doesn't need to be used anymore. So I don't want to cut any of the little folded bits, but any of the long bits where I've changed strips, they can all just be trimmed off to where that cut edge is. So now I'm just going to put my facing on. So this just sits on here. So if you're making an actual neckline, this could be a facing or it could just be your lining. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to sew from this side, because then I can just follow that stitch line and make sure that it doesn't stray from that line at all. So I'm just going to pin all of this on ready to sew. And that's now ready to sew on. So I'm just going to sew exactly on this line. That's all now sewn on, so I can turn it over and see how it looks. So it's already starting to look really cool. I just need to finish it off so that that facing sits on the inside and doesn't poke through, and it sits nice and flat. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to do some understitching. So I'm going to sew it on this facing, or it will be on your lining if you have a lining, and I'll show you just how to stitch this down here. So I've pulled my seam allowance to this side so it sits under the facing or under the lining if you're using that. And I just want to understitch this like I would anything else. So about 2mm from that seam, I'm just going to sew through, and you're basically sewing through all of these little rouleau pieces as well. With that all sewn on, I'm now ready to trim. So I want to be trimming both seam allowances on both sides, but I don't want to be trimming my little rouleaus because it's gonna get a bit fragile. So with the understitching, it already means it's got a reasonable amount of seam allowance still. I'm cutting off about 4mm here, so it's still leaving me 6mm. So I'm just going to work my way across and trim both seams separately, making sure I don't accidentally snip the rouleau, to get rid of a lot of that bulk. And it doesn't just get rid of the bulk, it helps when it's going on a curve. It doesn't matter so much if you're doing this on like a cuff edge or something straight, but when it's on a curve, it's just going to sit a lot flatter. So I'm just going to get that trimmed on both sides. So I've now trimmed and I've given it a really good press. So you can see how nice and neat that looks once you've finished it off. So as I said, you can do variations with this. This is one that I've done on a much smaller scale with a contrast, and you can see using the print, it mixes up the colour a little bit as well. Another option is you could alternate the rouleau colours. You can vary the sizes, you could vary the widths, you could have a thick one and a thin one. There are so many variations you can do. The best thing is if you've got enough fabric just to play around and decide what you want to do. But this technique will work on any kind of neck trim, cuff, armhole. It just depends what the style is to what kind of size you do this. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and you're going to have a go at doing this kind of trim. As I said, there are so many variations that you can play around with different sizes, different widths, different lengths, different colours, mixing them up using prints. Just have a play around and see what you like. If you like this video, then make sure you check out my other videos. I've got lots of different sewing skills and pattern cutting techniques for you to learn, and lots of full projects too.